Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast, episode 90.
Welcome to the Out of Order Podcast, your window into the firearms community, exploring those shaping the future of our rights and protecting our lifestyle, laws, legal cases, activism, and self-defense in a candid and honest podcast for our brothers and sisters in arms. Here's your host, James Kalita.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 90 of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Today's show notes page is outoforderjameskalita.com/90. Today's sponsor, giftforgunnuts.com. Giftforgunnuts.com, where you can get great gift ideas for the hunting and firearms enthusiast on your holiday shopping list. Head over to giftforgunnuts.com. They'll see daily updates there with great gift ideas for hunting gifts, shooting gifts, IDPA gifts, all that good stuff. So take a look over there, and of course you can always help out the show by using any of the search bars on the outoforderjameskalita.com page. Just go to outoforderjameskalita.com, click on the show notes page. There'll be an Amazon search bar there with type in whatever you're looking for, and you'll generate a commission, help out the show without any additional cost to you. We're also sponsored by Liberty Classroom, where you get the history and economics they didn't teach you in high school, and by Liberty Maniacs, where you can find great t-shirts, Liberty t-shirts, pro-gun t-shirts, mugs, bags, lots of great gear. So if you head over to the show notes page, outoforderjameskalita.com/90, you'll find links to both of those. Today's guest is Rob Pincus, and now here's Rob.
Rob Pincus, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be on the show with you, James. Thanks for having me this morning.
Oh, my pleasure. So, Rob, you're involved in a incredible amount of things, and I almost don't know where to start, but I guess it all started with I.C.E. training. Would you tell us a little about that and how it all began?
Yeah, I.C.E. Training Company is definitely the centerpiece, I guess. It's the company that I own and that really is the foundation for all of the training activities, which is my primary vocation and has been my primary career for full-time, almost 15 years now, about 15 years now, and part-time for over 20, one way or another. My career actually started in the firearms industry. I always mark my first attendance at SHOT Show in 1997. And I've done a lot of different things, as you alluded to, a lot of different things inside of the firearms industry, but primarily education and training have been the focus. I.C.E. Training Company has actually only been in existence since about 2008. Prior to that first decade, I worked as an adjunct for several other schools, wrote for several magazines. I worked very closely with SWAT magazine, did some TV shows, and the longest, most continually running program that I've actually been involved with is Personal Defense Network. So Personal Defense Network started in 2005 as a DVD series, and we partnered up with the NRA, distributed millions of DVDs. We've been partnered with Second Amendment Foundation, Guns and Ammo Magazine, of course, the Valhalla Training Center, which I ran during the 2000s, and that continues today as an online website distribution, streaming of video as well as downloads, distance education at personaldefensenetwork.com, and articles as well. So we've got a whole team of contributing experts in a variety of personal defense areas. So my career has been primarily focused on education, but I've been involved in manufacturing and marketing, advertising, again, television production, video production, and things like that along the way as well. Even did a podcast for like 3 months at one point.
Oh, wow. All right. So is the I guess the curriculum the same between Personal Defense Network and I.C.E., or is there sort of a different target audience for each one?
Well, Personal Defense Network is primarily aimed at people interested in any aspect of personal defense, safety, or security education, as the name sort of reveals. But I.C.E. Training Company provides training and develops curriculum for both people interested in personal defense and armed professionals. So we've done, and that really ties in with the lineage that I.C.E. Training Company shares with the Valhalla Training Center, ties in with a lot of the programs that we've developed for the military, especially the special operations community, and the law enforcement personnel. Executive protection, which is also an area that I've worked in the past, was a big part of the curriculum development at the Valhalla Training Center, and a lot of the executive protection curriculum obviously rolls over to things like defense of one's family, taking care of others, defending people that you care about in the workplace or in the public space. So there is a lot of interconnectivity. Some of the facets of law enforcement training play over into armed security, obviously. Some of them don't. Some of the things that we teach military special operations guys in low-profile situations play over into concealed carry techniques and tactics for the civilian. So there's a lot of crossover and connection. I think the biggest difference between I.C.E. Training Company and Personal Defense Network really is the method of delivery. So I.C.E. Training Company is primarily a hands-on, you come to the class, you go to the range, you sit in the classroom, you attend the lecture, personal interaction with myself or one of our certified instructors and the student, whereas Personal Defense Network really is a delivery mechanism for distance education videos and articles where someone can get training at a much lower cost investment, a much lower effort investment, because they don't actually have to show up, right? The training shows up on your smartphone, your computer, your tablet, whatever it may be.
Excellent. And so you mentioned SHOT Show in 1997. Was there something that happened that sort of ignited the passion for you at SHOT Show, or?
I was involved in I was a consumer, right, in the industry. So I was doing a lot of shooting, for well over a decade by then, and owned several firearms, had a concealed carry permit, was working as a reserve law enforcement officer, was working, had worked in executive protection and private security, both armed and unarmed, for many years at that point, and really had always imagined that I would end up. My father was a police officer. He was the kind of police officer that wasn't a shooter, right? There's police officers whose gun is just a tool, like the radio or the handcuffs or whatever else, and they kind of do what they need to do to learn how to use it. He was a good shooter, but wasn't a shooter as a hobbyist or as an avocation. Didn't own firearms outside of the ones he owned for work or the ones he was issued by the department. So the guns were around, and I was interested in guns, and it became for me a hobby and avocation, a passion. But I always assumed I would be in some kind of an armed professional capacity. I was commissioned as an officer in the military after attending the Military College of Vermont, and I went into the IRR almost immediately. As I said, worked in law enforcement. I've held a badge, either full-time or reserve, almost constantly since 1995. There were a couple years where I was living in an area where a reserve commission wasn't available, and certainly too busy at that time to be a full-time officer with any agency. But other than those couple of years, I have held a badge and been at least a reserve deputy with a sheriff's office or a full-time member of an actual police department, and was kind of surprised, I guess, by the mid-'90s that wasn't really where I was going. I was much more interested in getting interested very much in teaching and education, and found out that I just really wasn't maybe cut out for the bureaucracy of the public sector work in a way that I had maybe anticipated that I would be. So after that realization, looking for other ways to fund a lifestyle, obviously, fund a life, as it were. At that point, I had a kid, I was married, and was starting to work, like I said, writing for some magazines and doing some marketing work and advertising consulting work for the firearms community, because having been a shooter for a long time, and definitely being involved in electronic communication, or the internet was kind of new then. And I have been talking about guns electronically since the mid-'80s on dial-up bulletin board systems and 300 baud modems. So found a little bit of an expertise there, a little bit ahead of the curve as far as the digital communications about firearms, and utilizing the power of the internet to educate and to advertise and market. And I found myself with the opportunity to go out to SHOT Show as a buyer for the gun shop that I frequented in Nashville, Tennessee. And I ended up going out to SHOT Show, and one of the things that gets criticized now in the community, of course, is people who, their buddy who owns the gun shop hooks them up with a pass to SHOT Show, and it creates a lot of congestion in the aisles and distraction in the booths. I'm proud to say that while, yes, I did show up not as a full-time employee of a gun shop, but as one of those infamous buyer passes, I actually did set the gun shop up with 3 new lines and a relationship with a distributor that they didn't have before. So I did some work. I wasn't just clogging the aisles and gawking at the guns I had never seen before my first SHOT Show. So it was, I think that's important to me in terms of really having started to learn the industry as early as I could. And obviously networked myself into some other relationships that on that trip that have bore some great fruit. I think for me, for the industry, for the community, some of the earliest connections I had at that time through some of the work I was doing with fundraising for charity events, for managing charity events around the shooting sports, recreational sports. Some of those relationships I still have to this day, relationships with the National Shooting Sports Foundation and several major manufacturers that I got to know very, very early on in my career. So it sort of grew very organically. And by 2001, I decided to leave full-time law enforcement and get into a career of teaching full-time. And that was the summer of 2001. Then, of course, 9/11 happened, and that really changed the landscape of the private sector training industry in terms of the demand for personal defense training and the tendency for the public sector to look outside of their own ranks for some of the cutting-edge stuff that was coming out of the private sector defensive training world, and the innovation and sort of the ease with which we could make a left turn or make a right turn because there wasn't any bureaucracy in a private company, or not nearly the bureaucracy that existed inside of the military or law enforcement communities. And that's what put us in a position with Valhalla Training Center to provide some really fantastic training that was, I think, very valuable. And I know the feedback we got was that it was very valuable from a lot of the guys that were actually on the ground fighting those wars during the mid-2000s.
And going back to the Personal Defense Network, there's a lot of intense feelings out there about distance education and firearms training. How useful do you feel like it can be? How can it be a primary source? Is it better as a secondary? What are your thoughts there?
Well, it depends on what you're looking at, right? So one of the biggest detractors, I think, of any kind of distance education related to firearms are the hobbyists. They're the shooters. They're the people that really obsess over timers and group size and marksmanship. Can I teach the principles of marksmanship through a video, or can somebody read about the principles of marksmanship through a book? Absolutely. Can they learn to shoot through a video or a downloadable PDF? Not really. They can learn the components of shooting, but they can't learn to press the trigger well. They can't learn to manage recoil. Those are physical activities. It reminds me of the instructors or the would-be instructors who sort of quote the middle school guidance counselor version of learning styles and adult learning styles then after that and say, well, some people are visual learners, so I have to demonstrate. Well, you can demonstrate all day long, but the same people that would criticize Personal Defense Network for trying to show something in a video that people have to physically experience, I don't care how many times you demonstrate something in front of a student, until they put the gun in their hand and pull the trigger and manage recoil, they're not really experiencing that and learning to manage recoil efficiently or at all, really, in any way. So are there valid criticisms? Well, yeah, if someone is putting out a distance education course that purports to be teaching someone how to shoot and suggesting that that's all they need, and then put the gun in their holster and walk around confident that they'll be able to use the gun, that's silly. It's foolish. But as far as the teaching somebody the components of home defense tactics, teaching someone best practices when it comes to selecting a holster, teaching somebody about how to interact with law enforcement while they're armed or in the immediate aftermath of a shooting. There are countless hours, right, where someone could literally, we have 1,000 months to live and you got to spend 300 of them sleeping. You could spend some significant portion of the other 700 months that the average human is alive just learning conceptual and principle-based information related to health, security, medical training, armed defense, unarmed defense, armed defense other than firearms, the nuances of firearms and maintaining firearms and accessorizing firearms. I mean, there's a world of information out there that can very validly be taught and learned through other than hands-on experience. Ultimately, if you want to learn how to punch, if you want to learn how to manage recoil, you want to learn how to reload a gun, you got to get out there and physically do it. Absolutely.
Yeah, and also probably very specialized and unique areas of firearms training that you might not have the best qualified person locally, but you can access that through a network like yours, where you have such a wide variety of trainers out there, with each having their own sort of resume of skills.
Oh, absolutely. It's huge. I mean, your point at the end there is probably the most important point to make about Personal Defense Network. It's not just me. It's not 600 videos of me, right? Like my mom doesn't even want to watch that much, right? Like that's not a thing, but there are 600 videos on there, and we have, maybe 40 or 50 different people who've contributed, and probably a good, 24 who've contributed significantly over a long period of years, who are experts in their field. I think of Caleb Causey with the medical information, Marty Hayes from Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network with legal information, Mike Seeklander, another firearms instructor. We, in many ways, people might view us as, competitors in the industry in terms of attention from people who want firearms training, because we teach on very similar topics. We cover very similar things, and probably about 80% of what we teach overlaps. But the nuances, that other 20%, the difference in presentation, the difference in vernacular, the difference in detail might help someone that watches Personal Defense Network. So maybe Mike brings some audience in and they learn something from one of my videos that they didn't learn from him, even though we both kind of teach the same thing. They just hear it differently or see it differently, and that makes all the difference in the world. So there is a diverse collection of people contributing to Personal Defense Network. But I think it's also important to remember that there's a difference when you think about the resources that people have in their hometown. If you have that local concealed carry permit instructor person, probably is really, really good if they're successful, if they have positive reviews, if they're at their website, if you go to their website and it looks professional, if you go to their Facebook and you see positive interaction with their students, they're probably a great resource for the concealed carry permit in your hometown. But the reality is they may not have seen more than that demographic and that level of student opens them up to. Now, maybe they have. Maybe they've traveled the world and they've taught all over the place, and you happen to have that local instructor, but it's very rare. So what Personal Defense Network gives you an opportunity to do is learn something about firearm selection from someone who has seen literally thousands of students across the world with scores of different guns and dozens of different types of guns in their hands at every skill level, under every weather condition imaginable, on 50 different ranges around Earth, and get that person's insight in handgun selection, and you're probably getting a much more qualified opinion than the person who locally deals with, maybe he's taught 300 students and maybe he's seen, 12 different firearms in those classes regularly and not 50 over the course of a decade. And I think that's really important to understand, is the perspective that comes with the contributors to the network. One of the other things I demand is that the only people who are allowed to contribute to Personal Defense Network have to be teaching their topic. They can't be, for example, a police officer writing about gun selection. They need to be a police officer who teaches civilian firearms courses, or one who teaches inside of law enforcement in a way that would include firearm selection. The reality is most police officers don't get to choose anything about their firearm. They get handed, they get issued a gun. Here's the gun you've used. And over the course of their career, they might get issued 2 or 3 different types of firearms. But if they're not teaching that, if they're not really dealing with the struggles that people have when it comes to hand size, hand shape, strength, and all the variations of gun shape and grip size that there are, then they're not really qualified to educate on that, especially when you're not hands-on with someone. Your opinions are going to be very, very, very narrow and limited. On the other hand, there's some other things that that same police officer might teach. He might teach, defensive tactics. Well, there's a lot of different shapes and sizes of police officers, so they probably do deal with a lot of different strengths and fitness levels and athleticism levels with a wide variety of people when they teach defensive tactics inside of law enforcement. So that would be a completely valid area for them to offer information inside of Personal Defense Network about humans fighting with humans, regardless of shape, size, strength, and all that.
And you mentioned firearm selection, and as I understand, you helped design a firearm. Is it what you consider to be the ideal concealed carry firearm?
Well, it's going to, hopefully be the ideal concealed carry firearm for a lot of people. I don't think that any such thing would exist universally. That's important. As I said, there's a lot of different shapes and sizes of hands out there. What I think, and we're talking about the Avidity Arms PD-10. So really from napkin sketch to production, that gun is my design and my ideas about what would make absolutely a good option for a defensive carry firearm, and probably will fit a lot of people. One of the maybe ironies of it is that the gun, as it's going to be released, the very first iteration of the firearm, is not the perfect carry gun for me. It really is the average amalgamation of what I think will fit the vast majority of human hands, what I think will serve the purposes necessary for the vast majority of personal defense and home defense and workplace defense situations for individuals who are carrying concealed firearms, or staging a firearm that's going to be very shootable, very easy for them to shoot inside of a quick access safe or something like that. But the grip size, the actual configuration of our first gun is really aimed at filling a void in the market that is still congruent with everything else, not just being different to be different. I'll give you an example. A lot of people for decades now have asked for single stack Glock 19. So in other words, take something, a mid-sized Glock with about a 4-inch barrel, a little over a 4-inch barrel, and instead of a double stack gun, make it a single stack gun. Well, Glock has come out with some subcompact single stack guns, and other companies, I carry a subcompact single stack gun with a 4-inch barrel that holds 8 rounds, 7+1, and that's the Springfield XDS 4-inch. The Springfield XDS 4-inch gun happens to be the best configuration of gun shape and size with a capacity that I'm comfortable with and shootability that I'm comfortable with for me to carry. But it's got a very short grip. The grip on the PD-10 is a longer grip. It's a full-size grip, more like a 1911. A lot of people over the last 20, 30 years I've been involved in training have said how much they love the slim feel of the full-size 1911 in their hands, and it feels better to them than a Glock or an M&P or a full-size Springfield XD, the kinds of guns we generally recommend because of their reliability, because of the design of the striker-fired system, the efficiency of use. So the PD-10 sort of takes the best of the efficiency and design reliability of the striker-fired gun and combines it with the slim ergonomics that a lot of people love about the old 1911s and makes it a full-size gun, which none of the major manufacturers have produced. They haven't given us a single-stack, slim, full-size defensive 9mm carry gun. So that's what this is. Now, very quickly, we're going to have a second version that will have a chopped grip. It will only hold 8 rounds instead of 10, and that gun will be configured around what I think is personally the best size carry gun for me. And I know that for a lot of other people with similar body type, that PD-8 will be easier to carry than the PD-10. But the PD-10 is going to be easier to shoot, and it's going to be perfectly appropriate for carry for a wide variety of people, and it'll be great for staging for home defense and potentially for duty use for armed professionals that need a slim gun, executive protection officers, plainclothes police officers, but probably not a duty gun for uniformed police officers because it's only got 11 rounds, and in that size of a pistol with a little more width, you'll probably be able to get 18 to 20 rounds pretty easily, and that's something that you may see in the future from us.
Wow. And what's the anticipated arrival date for the PD-10?
Not soon enough.
Okay.
We've definitely made some mistakes in terms of anticipating when that would be. I've realized now that it's virtually impossible to put a finger on that. I've learned a lot as a new manufacturer. We're a new startup company. I didn't want to do a gun that was kind of sort of inspired by Rob. There's a lot of guns out there that essentially are just like almost to the point of like a different color, and now all of a sudden it's a limited edition namesake gun from some nationally renowned trainer. And I've done that. I've been guilty of doing some of those special projects where it's nice to see the I.C.E. training logo on a gun and to see the features or accessories of the gun accentuated the way I would like them or the way I think people would need them. But that's very, very taking an AR-15 or an existing gun from Smith & Wesson and changing the color, putting a different set of sights on it and calling it a new gun is a little disingenuous. I believe, and I've said this enough that you'd think someone would stand up with the challenge if there was one to be had. I believe this is the first time that a gun really has been taken from concept, from napkin sketch, all the way through production to the retail shelf by someone from the training portion of the industry. A lot of people lament that the guns are manufactured, the guns are designed by engineers, not shooters, or the guns are designed by the marketing team, not the people who actually, deal with shooting and skill development out on the range. And this one is a gun that's been designed by somebody who's watched, thousands of hands on thousands of guns over a couple of decades at all different skill levels. There have certainly been instructors who've been influential in gun designs. Everyone would credit Jeff Cooper with being influential on the Bren 10, but that gun was designed. It was done. He just said, hey, switch it from 45 to 10 millimeter. People would credit Bill Jordan with the Smith & Wesson Combat Magnum, the Model 19, which is a great gun. One of my favorite guns. It was a gun that my dad used in law enforcement, a gun that I have in my collection now. But it's a revolver that really just took a caliber and a frame size and matched them together, as opposed to the way the guns were being made, prior to that. It wasn't an innovation or an evolution really in the gun design itself. There's a couple other little isolated examples out there. The most recent is one of our Personal Defense Network regular contributors and actually the host of our training talk show, Grant Cunningham, was very involved in the design of the Kimber revolver. That Kimber revolver, everyone who shoots it, that's a revolver person, loves it, but it's a revolver, which makes it a little bit, out of touch with the cutting edge. And he will tell you that the internal design of the gun was not exactly what he wanted, and probably where the biggest potential innovations were for the revolver, but Kimber decided to go in a different direction internally than exactly what he wanted. So again, I'm really proud of the fact that we're doing the PD-10 the way we're doing it, and that it is being true to my design, and it'll stand or fall in the consumer market solely based on my design, my ideas, and the efficacy or the reliability of that design in people's hands. And that's the hard part, right? It turns out it's pretty easy to fabricate a gun if you have the money and you have the interest, but to actually get to the point where you're making thousands of them a month, that's the jump. So we've been struggling with that jump from guns that shoot and work on, one at a time, sort of hand fit, making sure everything's perfect, making that jump to the right tolerances and the right materials, and then the durability over 10,000 rounds that we want at the price point we want, at a $500 retail price. So there's a lot of moving parts that we're finally getting to the point where I do see light at the end of the tunnel, but I would have told you the same thing a year ago, and here we are a year later fighting some of those same fights. So the gun won't be, I will tell you this, the gun will not be released to the public until I'm confident that it can be carried for the purposes of defending yourself or those you care about. And that means I have to be able to trust, a randomly picked gun off the line to put in a holster, certainly shoot it, make sure that individual gun works with the ammo that I'm carrying, but that I would expect that the gun would pass those tests and that I would carry that gun to defend my 3-year-old daughter. If I don't believe that, we're not going to ship a gun.
Right. Yeah, and it must be an overwhelming process. You said it was easy to have one fabricated, but I think I'd be daunted just by going through that pass, going, every single part from scratch.
Because I don't do any I don't actually they don't even really let me touch tools. So I get to work with the engineer. Brad Thomas has been our engineer on the project from literally day zero, and I get to work with him, and then he works with the guys that actually have the that touch the machines, and the other guy that does the coding, and then they, when he's happy with it, he sends it to me and says, here you go, and then I say, oh, that's awesome, or I say, what's that all about? Why does it feel like that, or why does it look like that? And that kind of process goes back and forth. But really, we've been 2 years this week, actually. It was the last week in September of 2016 was the first time that I handed the gun to people who weren't involved in the project and said, here, try it out and shoot it. And it was at the instructor. We run an instructor conference every year for our certified instructors under the I.C.E. training company. And it was at our conference in 2016 at my home range down in Florida that we first let a bunch of people shoot it. Maybe 30, 40 people shot the gun that weekend. And we knew it had some issues, but it really was at that point reliable enough and shootable enough for people to get an idea what the gun was going to be like or what it was like. And if you would have asked me then, I would have told you, oh, man, we must be within 6 months. And, again, here we are 2 years later. So the movement to that first shootable gun to show people was much faster than the movement from that point to a gun that is going to be on retail shelves. And I guess that's what I meant by saying it was relatively easy to fabricate.
Gotcha. So you're also involved in 2 other organizations. 2AO, would you like to tell us a little about that?
Yeah, so I.C.E. Training Company and Personal Defense Network are primarily training educational organizations. I've just recently taken on, accepted a position with the board of directors of the Second Amendment organization and now serve as their executive vice president. And that is political entity. It's an entity that certainly is involved in education, but it's education about gun rights and gun responsibilities and the issues surrounding the politics of guns in the U.S. So, for example, we, as part of my agreeing to take that position, I wanted to publish the most comprehensive collection of gun rights issues, position statements that's available online. I wanted to work with the board to develop some clear and concise position statements on things like whether training should be mandatory for someone to be able to purchase a firearm, take positions on the various federal firearms laws, the National Firearms Act, Gun Control Act, etc. And we have just about 60 position statements now published at. You can see them at gunrights.info. Gunrights.info. You can also see it on our blog at 2AO.org. You can see the blog articles. It's broken down. The 60 position statements are broken down into 6 categories, not evenly. One of them may have 15 or 16 position statements, and another one, like for example, the one that covers ammunition. In the area of ammunition, there's really not that much to talk about. I think there's probably only 5 or 6 position statements under ammunition that are separate from everything else. But those position statements have been now published. I'm actually doing a live Q&A. I'll imagine I'll do a couple of those under on the social media through 2AO as people start to read through these and they get disseminated. But I wanted those position statements to be a resource, not just for the firearms community, or not just to express my opinion or now the opinion of 2AO, but really as a resource even for people who are on, quote unquote, the other side. I've come to realize over the years that the other side, we generalize about it as if they're all, anti-gunners who want to take all the guns away, and that's really not what we're dealing with. There's a whole bunch of middle ground where there are people who are essentially pro-gun rights, where I certainly am, or pro-gun control, where I'm certainly not. But there are the vast majority of people on both sides of that coin. That coin would be called the gun responsibility coin, and gun responsibility is something that I think the vast majority of Americans are interested in. Now, how we envision that, what that means in practice, what that means in theory, that's where the discussion should be. So by publishing these position statements, I hope to be a resource also for people that might come to the conversation from a more pro-gun control side and be able to see that there are people on the pro-gun rights side who aren't extremists that would suggest that every human being on earth should be armed at all times, and that's going to make the world a better place. That's clearly not my position. That's not the position of the Second Amendment organization. I don't think it's the position of the vast majority of firearms owners out there today. There are people who are firearms owners who are offended by or embarrassed by the statements and actions of other firearms owners. And I'm sure that that's the case on the pro-gun control or the anti-gun side as well. So finding the collaborators, finding the people interested in the dialogue is one of the missions of Second Amendment organization, is to go out there and help end gun negligence by admitting that there are some problems inside of the gun world, educating about them, and obviously changing some minds on the people who are more into thinking that legislation, more gun control, is what's going to make Earth better. I don't believe that. I believe it's education. I believe it's public awareness. And I really believe at this point, having watched this political fight or been involved in this political fight for 2 or 3 decades, I believe now what we need is to refocus our efforts, not so much on the anti-gunners, but refocus our efforts internally and really educate and police our own about best practices and ending gun negligence and being a better grassroots advocate for the Second Amendment and the responsible exercise of our Second Amendment rights. So that's where we're focused. 2AO was originally focused on celebrating pro-gun businesses across America. In the wake of Sandy Hook, the organization was formed to celebrate, promote, and motivate the support of the Second Amendment from businesses not in the gun community. It really was a counter movement to the gun-free zone movement. If you think about, I think it was specifically like Buffalo Wild Wings, right? They said, well, we don't want any concealed carry. We were a gun-free zone as our restaurant. We don't want anybody bringing guns into our restaurant. And there was a backlash, right? There was a backlash against them from gun owners. And then there was also some opportunistic action by other restaurants saying, well, we like concealed carry people. In fact, if you show us your concealed carry permit, we're going to give you 10% off. And that movement sort of started coalescing around the Second Amendment organization. So Second Amendment organization's primary mission has always been to celebrate and motivate support for the Second Amendment from the business community around the U.S., individual locally owned businesses, nationwide chains. And then we've now expanded that mission to include grassroots education for advocacy in a responsible way, and increasing the responsibility being met by gun owners in general to end gun negligence and try to curb some of the things like, teen suicide with a parent's gun, for example. Somewhere in there's some gun negligence. If you're allowing access by the teen to the gun, something's wrong. So that would be an example of gun negligence that we're trying to fight inside the gun community, and without fear of anti-gunners pointing a finger and saying, look, even this pro-gun organization admits there's problems with guns. Well, if we can't do that, then maybe we shouldn't be owning guns.
And I understand you're also on the board for Walk the Talk America?
Walk the Talk America is another organization that I joined the board of earlier this summer. Walk the Talk America was founded by Mike Sedini, the president of Eagle Imports. And it was founded by Mike to as the name implies, actually do something in regard to, again, suicide prevention and gun negligence and trauma mitigation are really the main areas that Walk the Talk America focuses on. And what he wanted to do was bring together some leaders in the gun industry and some leaders in the mental health profession and really address some causes and do some outreach and do some intervention before the tragedies, before the suicides, before the spree shootings, before the murder-suicides, before the issues of gun involvement in irrational behavior, self-destructive behavior, or violent behavior, whether it's inside of the legal gun community or in what is the ramifications of guns being stolen or misused or owned and possessed by criminals, in terms of even mitigation of trauma for people who work in a gun store, who may be witness to a range retail environment where they may be witness to someone completing a suicide with a firearm. How do we get involved in stopping not only the attempted suicide, but also the trauma that occurs afterwards? And working with mental health professionals is how we do it. Mike started doing the research on what was actually being done, and essentially it was a lot of finger pointing. There was a lot of people pointing at, well, this is a mental health issue, this is a mental health issue from the pro-gun side, from the gun community, but not really identifying anything other than that. And it really, it's very much like someone who wants to stand, in front of a camera and say, it's the guns, it's the guns. Well, if you're just pointing a finger and saying it's the guns, but you're not going to take away guns, you've got the Second Amendment, like the guns are here, so let's do something else. Same thing, we as the gun community can't just point across the aisle and say, well, it's mental health, without actually asking some hard questions and maybe getting involved in how we can work with mental health professionals. So the partnership with Mental Health America that Mike has put together, and some of the initiatives that Walk the Talk America are coming out with to be involved in schools at the education and screening level for kids, to be involved in ranges at the suicide prevention, providing training and mitigation and some services to gun owners who maybe don't want to have the guns or shouldn't have the guns in their lives, without the involvement of the government, without the involvement of the police, without having to call an anonymous tip line and hope that somebody intervenes before your friend kills themselves. Giving gun owners the permission and maybe reminding them that in some ways they have a responsibility to take appropriate actions. One of the examples I use is, if you're taking the keys away from that older family member, you probably should very seriously think about taking the guns away as well. If that person isn't going to be trusted to drive the car, does it make sense that they have the loaded gun, leaning up against the door or whatever? We just had recently a grandfather killed his granddaughter, and immediately the family came out and said, well, he's been suffering from dementia. He thought she was an intruder, or he thought there was an intruder in the house and shot and killed her. And, well, if you knew he was suffering from dementia, why, and maybe they did. I don't know. Maybe they tried to get the gun away. Maybe they were taking those steps But at some point, when I see a story like that, the tragedy is threefold, because it's a tragedy that obviously affected that family. It's a tragedy that affects the gun community, but the real tragedy is the education and the intervention that didn't happen if you knew there was a mental problem that would affect judgment, and yet there was a firearm poised to be used ostensibly for defense that ends up being part of a tragedy of negligence.
Thank you. Well, Rob, I thank you so much for being on the show, and I'll link to everything we talked about on the show notes page. Any parting words for our listeners?
I think that's it. I really appreciate being on the show. I appreciate being able to talk about the three different facets of what I'm involved in currently. I guess four, really, because we included the manufacturing, talked about the Avidity PD10, and people can find those resources online. They can find me on social media. I really enjoyed the dialogue. I enjoyed the conversation. So if people have questions or even challenges to some of the stuff I've said, I hope to see it in the comments under the podcast or on my social media, and we'll go from there.
Well, thank you very much for being on the show. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, James. I feel the same.
Thanks again for tuning in to episode 90 of the Out of Order Gun Rights podcast. Show notes for today's episode is outoforderjameskalita.com/90. Head over to the show notes page. You'll find links to the websites we talked about with Rob, to his books, and to our sponsors, Liberty Maniacs, Liberty Classroom, and giftforgunnuts.com. This is Out of Order James Kalita. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.